My name is Sammy Brown, and I just came into town. Saw your ad. You're Mr. Lee, so you can make a mint on me.
What do you do?
Dance, sing.
Play a role?
Anything. Say I'm a fine for guys like you, 'cause there's nothing I can't do.
Tell me, what did you work before?
In a department store.
Who told you you could dance and sing?
Hey, for money, I'll do anything. Why don't you try me? You might as well.
You might be great.
Who can tell?
What do you call your specialty?
You mean my big sensation? I knock 'em cold when I pull off my Chevalier imitation.
Yeah.
It's the Marx Brothers Council Podcast, episode 77, and Always Zeppo. Happy New Year, Marx Brothers fans. I know, even though this is our January episode, it's coming out very late in the month, way past the time when it's acceptable to still be saying Happy New Year, Marx Brothers fans, but it's worse than you think. I'm actually saying Happy New Year from like 10 years ago. And let me add, 5440 or fight. I'm Noah Diamond here in the New York office, and floating above England on his magic carpet is the Honorable Pandu of Muftan, Matthew Conium. Say something, Your Honor.
Hello. I'm pretty damned average. How are you?
Pretty damned average. There was a time when the idea of a Zeppo Marx biography would have struck even diehard Marx Brothers fans as not just a profound unlikelihood, but an hilarious joke. How could there possibly be a book's worth of interest in a man whose public presence was defined by not being very interesting? Well, we've come a long way since the days when we were thinking that way, not only in our understanding of what an interesting figure the youngest Marx brother really was, but in our understanding of how much of the Marx Brothers story was, and perhaps still is, waiting to be considered and researched and told. Much of what we've learned about the Marx Brothers in the last decade, we've learned from Robert S. Bader, and it is, of course, to him that we owe the improbable existence of the excellent new biography, Zeppo, the Reluctant Marx Brother. We're going to try to keep this somewhat spoiler-free. Inevitably, we're going to talk about revelations that are contained in the book, but we'll try to avoid the kind of detail that might make you feel that you've heard too much if you haven't read the book yet. I just want to start, Matthew, if you don't mind, with a general observation about the writing in the book. Robert Bader writes very crisp, clean, journalistic prose, and I think we feel very familiar with his voice from Four of the Three Musketeers more than any other place. But I was thinking about how Four of the Three Musketeers is really kind of an epic because of its length, its scope, its ambition, and so the spareness of the prose feels like a necessity created by the sheer amount of information in the book. We have a lot to get to. We're going to just lay it down simply. And, organizing that much information into a coherent narrative is a tremendous authorial skill. Well, in the introduction to the Zeppo book, Bader says, if the story of the Marx Brothers is a triumphant show business tale, Zeppo's is a dimly lit film noir based on a gritty crime novel. That's a good insight, and it's really quite true. And, even though Robert Bader's recognizable voice pervades this book, it also does have a little bit of that quality to it. I was thinking throughout the book that a film based on it would have a lot of saxophone on the soundtrack. There is a little bit of poetry to it, and I think of another recent biography that I loved, Mark Harris's book about Mike Nichols, came out a few years ago. Anyone who read that may also have noticed a similarity between these two books. A lot of information, a lot of compelling stories about an essentially unknowable protagonist. There's my opening babble about it, Matthew. I'll set you up with a good straight line and ask you, how did you find the book?
I'm not going to fall for that one. Although it was actually sent to me for free by one of the lovely people in the Marx Brothers Council whose name I've forgotten. But it was a really, really lovely gesture. So that's the honest answer to that question. But yes, it is interesting, isn't it? Because we're so used to the kind of the thing that you always hear about Zeppo is that on screen he's the unimportant one, off screen he's either, take your pick, from the funniest or the most interesting or the strangest or whatever, and that really does come across. I think my standard answer to why isn't there a Marx Brothers biopic is because they basically led pretty boring ordinary lives for people in show business at that time, and there's really not a lot to hang a dramatic work on. This is rather different, actually. You could easily imagine Zeppo's story being used, not just a biopic of Zeppo, but using Zeppo's story as the central plank on which to build a general biopic of the team, I think, because it is enormously interesting and enormously colourful, and he is a very strange and fascinating and enigmatic person. Obviously, we've pledged not to spoil too much for people who haven't read the book, but I think it's going to be no great giveaway that there's lots in here about organized crime, among other things, and his often very, very close connection to some pretty serious crime figures. Having said all that, I think because I was familiar with a lot of other people feeding back into the council who'd read it before me, my overwhelming emotion was one of relief that the Zeppo that I was left with when I closed the book wasn't anything like as appalling as I was led to suspect. I mean, let's not beat about the bush. This isn't a wonderful heroic figure, but at the same time, I was expecting something really horrible in ways that were impossible to deal with, and I think what we've got here is kind of the standard negative take on Groucho times about 3 or 4, maybe.
Yeah, there's definitely that, and I mean the idea of that Zeppo was not very nice to his children is definitely a part of the story, and it's obvious that Zeppo's 2 sons, Tim and Tom Marx, and their friendship and cooperation with Bader seems to be the reason this book exists, and their perspective, especially on the later part of Zeppo's experience, the post-Marx Brothers years, let's say, is a huge undercurrent here, and an overcurrent, but then and Zeppo's, womanizing and all of this is very true, and it is familiar from other aspects of the Marx Brothers story. But rather than coming away from it with the feeling that I know some others have gotten, which is that Zeppo is kind of a monster, what I get is not so much malice as tremendous coldness. He just seems like an extremely cold figure, and partly that unknowable quality. Even the other Marx Brothers never quite seem to understand Zeppo. Bader makes that point very convincingly. The women in Zeppo's life, with the possible exception of Marion, don't seem to have really ever felt close to him or have figured out who he was. It seems like I didn't come away feeling like angry or, like, oh, what a terrible guy. I hate that guy. But the book did make me feel a little heavy-hearted about Zeppo, and in some ways about the whole family. All of these brothers, with one notable exception, had demons and struggles and significant unhappiness. I guess we can accept Gummo from that too, but there's something dutiful about Gummo's good attitude that feels sad to me too.
Yes, yeah, very sort of hangdog kind of, yeah. But even, I think, actually, even the one notable exception may be that there's possibly more there going on than we like to think. But yes, cold, but also self-centered to a degree, I think, that goes beyond SOB-ishness and into something maybe diagnosable. Yeah. The same kind of feeling that you get when you read biographies of Peter Sellers, that there really was actually something wrong with this man, that he genuinely couldn't see how outrageously self-centered he was. Yeah. I got a whiff of that as well.
Absolutely, yes, and Bader traces it very credibly to Zeppo's role in the act. Right from 1918 to the moment he left the act. Zeppo was sort of a professional disappointment. It was his job to be less than others, and he was treated as less than others. Both in terms of the financial structure of how the brothers were compensated for their work, and just being the younger brother on the totem pole. So of course he winds up being like the tough guy, the muscular guy, the one most who feels the most urgency about asserting his power. Isn't it interesting that the first thing Zeppo does independently of his brothers, while he's still sort of laying the groundwork for this career as an agent, which is what we think of as the thing he left the Marx Brothers to do, was this little stint as a restaurateur at a place called Perry's Brass Rail. A really interesting chapter that was totally news to me. If I've ever encountered that, a passing mention of that in one of the other books, I don't think I have. If I have, I've totally blacked it out. But it's really an interesting story that the Cullen Harrison Act, which was known as the Beer Act, legalized before Prohibition was repealed. 3.2% alcohol beer could be sold in restaurants. And it was the first legal alcohol since Prohibition began in 1920. And so, along with this boxer turned actor named Bob Perry, Zeppo becomes a partner in this quote-unquote restaurant called Perry's Brass Rail, where basically the point is to serve low-alcohol beer along with what Robert Bader describes as barely edible sandwiches, just to be, hey, we're a restaurant, folks. And this place, which opened in 1933, like just months before the release of Zeppo's final film work in Duck Soup, had a gay 90s theme. And that this is apparently Zeppo's doing. It was Zeppo's idea that that's what it should be. Bader talks about the birthday party for Frederick March toward the end of 1932 that had a gay 90s theme and was this huge Hollywood event that was all the rage and talked about for years, like Truman Capote's Black and White Ball or something like that. And those photos that we've all seen of Groucho dressed up as a gay 90s police officer with a handlebar mustache turns out to be from that party. So this idea that the gay 90s were all the rage in the 1930s, is further confirmation of Adam Gopnik's 40-year itch theory that I've talked about on this show before, that the highest point of cultural nostalgia is always for the moment 40 years ago, because people in their 40s tend to drive the culture. So anyway, the gay 90s to the 1930s. And Zeppo was responsible for making sure that the singing waiters at Perry's Brass Rail had handlebar mustaches and were appropriately dressed. Huge success. Zeppo could have just done that, could have managed restaurants. He seems to have really enjoyed it. He would be behind the bar himself, setting the tone for this celebrity watering hole, making the headlines, It was a place where it sounds like Zeppo was the star at Perry's Brass Rail, Wonder, maybe he had never had the feeling of being the star until that moment. But after a short period, he had gotten all he thought he wanted out of running a restaurant and just moved on to the next thing, which was being a Hollywood agent.
And this is the pattern all through, isn't it? You get this constant sense of tremendous restlessness and of never being satisfied for long with what he's doing, no matter how successful it is. And in many cases, staggeringly successful, but still after a while he starts either delegating and having nothing to do with it and moving on to something else, or he just ups and sells it and goes on to the next thing. He never seems to have been satisfied with much for long, and so you wonder if that trait wouldn't have manifested itself in the act, even if he was given a fair whack. After 10 or 20 years of doing that one, you get the feeling he would probably have itchy feet anyway. But I did come away actually with a lot more sympathy for him in terms of how he was treated in the act, because obviously again, previously we knew the bare bones, which was he didn't really deserve much consideration in the act because he didn't do anything. But there was this strange thing that they kept him on salary rather than made him, an equal quarter of the act, which you would think they would do simply by virtue of being brothers, regardless of how much he actually contributed. You just think that would be something they would want to do, and it would also be something that's much easier to do, to just present themselves to the studio as a conglomeration of four people who get paid a set amount which is divvied up between them. Instead, there's all this intricate wrangling where they get a slice of the pie and then they throw him a few crumbs, and this continuing right to the end, in a way that does seem to be, if not deliberately demeaning, incredibly blind to the obvious feelings that he must have had about that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I felt bad for him in that context too. And it's hard to completely understand why. We hear often about how important it was to keep the four Marx Brothers intact. That was important to everybody. Bader quotes a letter from Groucho in response to Zeppo's "I'm leaving the act" letter, which is, where Groucho sort of kids Zeppo about the trouble it's going to cause for them on sleeper cars, to be a threesome instead of a foursome. But obviously that wasn't important enough to anybody to just make him an equal partner. And it's kind of touching. I mean, a heartwarming moment in a story that doesn't have a lot of heartwarming moments in it comes in 1945 when Zeppo does for Gummo what the other brothers never did for him and makes Gummo a partner in the agency. Gummo found himself in the Zeppo situation. He's Zeppo's employee. He doesn't feel like he owns any of what's going on, even though he's has a share in the success. And the Zeppo Marx agency becomes Marx, Miller, and Marx. That's actually quite nice. And it's one of the few examples of like a figurative hug in the Zeppo story.
And also, that was another one of the occasions in the book where I really did feel like a hole had been filled in, because on the one hand, we know that we're always being told that this fabulous deal for room service was engineered by Zeppo. And then on the other hand, at the other end of the 40s, we know that all these deals are being made by Gummo. So it's somewhere, that baton has been handed from Zeppo to Gummo. And Bader gives us this lovely idea that Zeppo was basically so pissed off by them at the time of room service and how difficult to handle they were, that he basically said to Gummo, "You have them. From here on, they're your problem." So that was lovely, to fill in that gap.
Yeah, we've had that moment in his scrapbook interview, which Bader quotes, where Zeppo says something like, "I didn't want to deal with the Marx Brothers, so I told Gummo, they're your problem now." Yeah, it's good to get the story behind that that exclamation. And it's also, you can see Zeppo, he becomes an agent. He becomes formidable as an agent. He has this one particular superstar client, Barbara Stanwyck. And then he realizes, I'm mostly catering to the egos of performers. Like, this feels a little too familiar to me. I think maybe I'm done being an agent. And you can see how what happened to him as one of the Marx Brothers led him to this post-Marx Brothers career that's like, I'm going to get to be the best at one thing after another and then drop it. And like, I was the worst at this one thing, but I'm going to be the best at everything else. One interesting thing about the agency period, before we set that aside, is, for one thing, how neatly it overlaps with the beginning of the organized crime period. I mean, that tells you something. And in one way to understand Zeppo is he was this tough street scrappy kid who was well on his way to being a criminal. In order to prevent that and derail him from that, Minnie put him in the act. He stayed in the act until 1933, and then he left the act and went back to the criminal career he had begun when he was a child. But in the agency period, I didn't realize that all the Algonquin Round Table members were Zeppo's early clients, that he chiefly represented writers in the beginning, including Wolcott, Kaufman and Riskin, Parker.
And he seems to be very innovative in that way as well, in deliberately, going for interesting clients that would kind of get his name known, even if the actual speculation itself didn't pay off. He got a reputation very quickly as being somebody, who was useful in that way. Also, Alan Jones's agent, which I didn't realize.
Yeah, and Margaret Dumont.
Yes, yeah. But also, just returning to the organized crime here, Bader's got a very opens up a very interesting avenue of speculation that Zeppo and his knowledge of organized crime circles in Hollywood might have been the root of the legend of Louis B. Mayer's dislike for the team, disdain for the team, rather than just because he didn't think they were funny and Groucho was rude to him in a lift and all that horse shit. We've got we've got having no prior business with them. The possibility that Mayer didn't want the Marxes at MGM could have had something to do with Zeppo's intimate knowledge of Frank Orsatti's business and having knowledge of Mayer's involvement in some of Orsatti's less than legal activities.
Yeah, it's interesting that Zeppo's representation of Kaufman and Riskin, as it relates to the creation of A Night at the Opera, adds a wrinkle. We know mostly from Joe Adamson's book that early drafts of A Night at the Opera by other writers had a lot of good material in them. Adamson quotes a lot of Kalmar and Ruby material that was created for A Night at the Opera that kind of makes us wonder about that version of it. But interesting little detail that, by consistently trashing all the other writers' efforts and insisting on Kaufman and Riskin, Groucho, maybe intentionally, maybe not, was doing Zeppo a big favor, basically saying you have to negotiate with Zeppo to sign Kaufman and Riskin, the only writers we will accept on this project. It's really interesting. And if that was intentional on Groucho's part, it's one of a few examples of Groucho going out of his way to display a generosity towards Zeppo, maybe guilt-based generosity towards Zeppo, that Zeppo wasn't all that graceful about. In the later years, too, Groucho is helping Zeppo out financially. Well, we knew that, but we didn't know Zeppo was much richer than Groucho at the time.
Yeah. Just didn't need it at all, but was still happily taking the checks every month. Yeah,
and possibly even supporting Aaron Fleming's role in Groucho's life specifically to preserve the flow of those checks. That is pretty cold. Another story in the book that just kind of floored me. It's just a wonderful moment to think about. That is another example of Groucho kind of sticking up for Zeppo. Is this unbelievable tale of Groucho confronting Frank Sinatra about Barbara Blakely, leaving Zeppo for Sinatra. Well, at a time when, Frank Sinatra was not somebody just anybody felt comfortable going up to in public and like taking him to task for something. But Groucho, who Barbara in the unpublished memoir that Bader quotes from, says Groucho was a fearless octogenarian at this point. And just goes right up to Frank and at a charity event. Why don't you let Barbara go? You don't want her. Let her go back to Zeppo. And obviously Sinatra did not think that having any kind of response to Groucho was a good idea.
Yes, because if he had come back in any way, either verbal or physical, that would be in the story too. So he was obviously just dumbfounded as Groucho then turned and walked away. And I think Bader says repeated it again as he was walking away, didn't he?
Yeah.
It reminds me actually of a lovely story about A.J. Ayer, the English philosopher, when he was quite an old man and certainly not in any way, shape or form a strong man or an intimidating man in any way other than intellectually, was at a party where it was brought to his attention in an upstairs room. The boxer Mike Tyson was making, shall we say, unwelcome sexual advances to to the model Naomi Campbell, and nobody was doing anything about it. But A.J. Ayer, this little frail philosopher, strode up, burst open the door, told him to stop. Mike Tyson kind of went nose to nose with him and said, "Do you know who I am? I'm the heavyweight champion of the world." And A.J. Ayer said, "And I am the former Wickham Professor of Logic." It's got something of the feel of that to it, I think. One thing that struck me is, we've had to take on trust so much of this. Zeppo was the funny one off stage. Zeppo was the Groucho off stage. We finally got some solid confirmation here in the book. With there's a reproduction of a letter that he wrote to Marion after their divorce, his wife Marion, after their divorce, which I would say is as good as anything in the Groucho letters. If I was feeling generous, but feeling generous, that is, to Groucho. It's the kind of casually, spontaneously, naturally funny letter that I think much of the Groucho letters could only wish it was like. Groucho's letters, I think, often feel a bit laboured over in their effects. Whereas this doesn't. It's just very, very funny. He's talking about decorating his house, and he says, "Right now, I think the living room looks like a fruit salad, and the 2 bedrooms look like the same fruit salad after I vomited. Anyway, I did it, and I'm stuck with it, so if I ever wanted to sell it, I'd have to get some schmuck who's completely blind, and that ain't easy. Bing Crosby, who's colourblind, is the only one I know who has enough money to buy it, but my bar isn't big enough. About the ranch I bought, it's raw land, and I'm planting grapefruit. It will take about 4 years to bear fruit, and when it does, I hope to hell people will still want to eat them. If they don't, I'll be up to my ass in the stuff."
Yeah, he seems effortlessly funny.
Yeah,
very true. I love the anecdote. It's Bill Marx's story, and it's in Bill Marx's book, but Bader quotes it and reminded me of it. The story about how Zeppo made Groucho laugh hysterically at a party. And how rare it was for anybody to be able to have that effect on Groucho, to make Groucho not just chuckle, but, laugh so hard that he was crying. Boy, wouldn't you love to see Zeppo do that to his big brother?
And there's also some interesting stuff, isn't there, towards the end about Bader considers this whole issue of, why didn't Zeppo kind of come out again in the 70s when obviously he would have been of enormous interest to that new audience, and we get the Dick Cavett story about him charging too much and so on. But we also get a few occasions where he did get up onto stage and tell a few stories and get big laughs. And Bader sort of implies that even at this point, for Groucho, it was too much like the appendicitis story, and he actually next time round he didn't give him the chance to do that. So maybe we would have got a little bit more of Zeppo than we have.
Yeah, it is kind of surprising, isn't it? Especially
still that jealousy there.
Yeah, there are some indications, as we've alluded to, that maybe Groucho in these years had a kind of fondness for or defensiveness about Zeppo based on maybe guilt from the teen years. But you're right. One counterpoint to that is the way at the Gallery of Modern Art event, which we talked about a little bit in our Rohauer episode with Mike Rowe not that long ago. Yeah, Zeppo apparently scored with that audience, and Groucho was careful not to allow that to happen again. And it does seem true. I mean, we've often wondered, wow, it's such a shame Zeppo wasn't on Cavett. Zeppo wasn't more a part of the public scene at that point. But it is true, even without knowing this. Groucho could have made it so if he wanted to, That must be true.
Yeah, because Bader also says that the Zeppo interviews that we do have, particularly the Anobili stuff, was done because Groucho asked him to. It was that was a favor to Groucho, whether it's not whether a spontaneous favor or just to keep those checks coming in. But again, Groucho was the prime mover behind that.
Interesting to have we've often perceived the difference in tone between the Zeppo in the Anobili book, the scrapbook, and in the Charlotte Chandler book. I mean, we should have been able to put this together, but it hadn't ever occurred to me. Bader points out, well, that's because Zeppo was trying to date Charlotte Chandler. Date being a euphemism, I would say, in that sentence.
One thing that kind of leapt out at me, although it's kind of buried in a fairly long quote from Zeppo's son Tom. I don't know if it leapt at you likewise, but he's talking about the other Marx brothers and his impressions of them, and he's got a nice little story about Gummo, and he mentions Chico and whatever. And then he says something that I thought was quite extraordinary. I only saw Groucho twice in my life. Once in Beverly Hills and once in Palm Springs when we were older. I mean, that's quite something, isn't it?
Yeah.
To have enough knowledge of Chico and Gummo to recall things about them, and to have only seen Groucho twice.
I know, yeah. That's one of those little details that hurts a little. It feels like it's a little crack that lets in a lot of light to a family dynamic that is troubling and has these like icicles hanging around it. It does make some sense. I mean, Zeppo and Chico, we know, were kind of cut from the same cloth, had a lot of common interests, knew a lot of people in common. It makes sense that they associated with each other maybe more than any other given two Marx brothers. And Zeppo and Gummo had business together, so it makes sense that Gummo would have been around. They also lived right across the street from each other for a period. But Zeppo's, I guess, indifference is maybe the correct word, to the two children that he and Marion adopted is quite bracing. It's not the usual, like, a distant father who didn't know how to express love and was just obsessed with his work. It's more like an angry dismissal, like a sort of almost a flat out, you do not matter to me, as a constant message from a father to his children. And it's really heartbreaking to read. Marion seems to have been a little bit better of a mother than he was as a father, but maybe not a catch either in that way. And yeah, you feel bad for Tim and especially Tom, the brother who had the hardest time.
I think the most chilling thing for me along those lines is Zeppo's will, where he just writes as a sentence, "I have a son called Tom."
Yeah.
Doesn't leave him any money, but just acknowledges that he exists, so that Tom can't then say, "Oh, he's forgotten about me," and make some kind of a claim to that. So it's just preempting any attempt by Tom to get any money, but in this characteristically ice cold way.
Yeah, that's really shocking. And how about Zeppo having this model train obsession, being obsessed with trains, and Zeppo having his friends over to build and play with these elaborate model train sets that his children weren't allowed anywhere near. It is a little interesting that Zeppo has a somewhat better father-son relationship with Barbara's son from the previous, who becomes known as Bobby Marx. And some of the nicer things about Zeppo in the book are memories of Bobby Marx's. So I guess he did find a way to sort of forgive and connect with Zeppo.
Yeah, and again, that's kind of the wrong way around again, isn't it? You would think if he was going to have these kind of problems, being a father, that he would find it much harder with the son that comes in a package with this wife than with the ones that he. I mean, I appreciate they were adopted, but nonetheless, the ones that were his from the start, and yet it seems to have been the other way around.
Yeah, yes. Bader sort of tells the story that because Zeppo was courting Barbara so ardently and really had to work pretty hard and persist for a long time to get her to marry him, one of the things he had to do to sort of win her was demonstrate that he could be a father figure to Tommy. So he started kind of faking it, to try to win Barbara.
Bobby.
Yeah, sort of, go show Barbara that he can be a father figure. And maybe over the course of faking it, he sort of established it for real, And it's like, I was really just trying to get in your mother's pants, but sure, let's go fishing,
Yeah, I mean, you certainly get the feeling that he's a lot easier with people that he doesn't feel any major obligation to. And I guess, as Bobby got older, that was, he kind of fitted into that, because he was he had no kind of legitimate responsibility for him at that point, so he was able to kind of loosen up around him. There are a few things in the book that I kind of wanted to know more about. For instance, he mentions that they became very friendly with Jobina Ralston, Marion and Zeppo. So you just wish there'd been some acknowledgement of her involvement with Humorisk there. I mean, did they even? I mean, it sounds absurd, but it's possible that they might have not even realised that they were those people. So
It does seem possible, especially in light of the story about Chico's funeral, where Zeppo
yes.
maybe didn't recognize Ruth Johnson.
Mm.
I mean, Bader draws that conclusion. I think he draws that conclusion very convincingly, that Barbara remembered Zeppo not recognizing Marion, which that, as Bader establishes, seems
Yes.
not likely at all, but that it might have been Ruth who did attend that event. Boy, that's a moment like where a ghost out of the past drifts through the scene and you don't even realize it.
And there's also an interesting story about Zeppo in one of his many public brawls, getting on the front page of the Los Angeles Times for having a fight with it's his film producer Alex Gottlieb. Alex Gottlieb, of course, was a friend of Groucho's and a neighbor of Groucho's. There's a letter to him in the Groucho letters that obviously displays, a non-professional friendship. He also adapted Time for Elizabeth for television. So he was well in with Groucho. So Bader talks at one point about them seriously considering disowning Zeppo because of things like that. So one imagines that caused a serious problem for Groucho.
Wow, yeah, I didn't realize. I didn't make that connection with who Gottlieb was. I, of course, just thought of Sig Ruman when I heard
yes. Gottlieb, eh?
Gottlieb, eh? Well, I want to say a few words about the pictures in the book, which are really quite generous. I think we've become sort of accustomed to this point, to the idea that a Robert Bader production is going to have a lot of great photos in it that we haven't seen before. This is really more than that. There's, I think, 24 pages of glossy photos in this book, including many that were new to me and others that were familiar, but that sort of look different now because of what we know. Two that I just want to comment on is one photograph of the four Marx Brothers taken in the fall of 1921 that I talked about back in episode 69, which was our Marxfest recap, because at his Marxfest presentation with Paul Wesolowski, Bader showed this photograph. And I thought, boy, I wish I had that photograph so I could look at it. And now here it is in the Zeppo book. Bader's caption says it is possibly the earliest photograph of Groucho's grease paint mustache. It does appear to be that way. And I guess it's Groucho's classic look with all the Marx Brothers looking so young that makes it such an arresting photograph. They're also, I guess, somewhere out on the road. Looks like a rural location. There's a tree behind them. It's just kind of interesting. Looks to me like the primeval Marx Brothers romping through the comedy Garden of Eden or something. And then another photograph, which has been familiar. It's turned up in other books and places before. We know the photograph, but I hadn't thought about it until now. It's the picture from Zeppo's wedding, where Marion and Zeppo are kissing in a chair, and all the other Marx Brothers are surrounding them. And they're all in kind of comic poses. It's very evocative of the Napoleon scene pictures from Alsace with all the four brothers gathered around Lotta Miles as Josephine, and the photo they took with Minnie that mimics that moment. However, thinking about it that way has prevented me in the past from realizing that this picture from Zeppo's wedding with Marion is one of those rare pictures of all five Marx Brothers. And I never think of it that way. We can all close our eyes and go through in our heads like the, handful of pictures we know that have all five brothers in them. This is one, and it's hilarious. And it's also kind of nice that the occasion is the marriage of the youngest brother. Anyway, for a Marx Brothers fan, just the photo pages alone are a good enough reason to want to own this book in print.
Just one very final observation from me then is, and I
Wait
I
a
may
minute.
be-
I'm going to interrupt here. Wait.
Okay.
Okay, I'm surprised you didn't point out that once again we get the ironing photo from Marx
yeah.
Brothers with no further information.
Well, it says it's a deleted scene, which is nice to see, because you often get people saying that it's just a posed, just an on-set gag shot.
I think it's a poke at you, Matthew, that he included this photo because of your obsession with it.
I didn't realize I was obsessed with it. I suppose over the years I may have returned to it a few times.
Well, there are things like with that photo and others, and this is true of all the Bader books. I mean, it's true of For the Three Musketeers, and speaking of Harpo, even the photos that are familiar, they just kind of look better here than we've seen them before. Like Bader has, originals or earlier generation copies from collections, and, they just look better. I mean, in the Zeppo book, that familiar photo of all five brothers with Sam and Minnie, taken in Illinois in 1914, it's a very familiar photo, partly because it's the entire Marx family in one frame. We've seen it in lots of places, but here and in For the Three Musketeers, it just looks better. It's not as many copies removed from the original, and instead of a big blob of undifferentiated black tuxedo, you can see the individual figures standing there. Anyway, just a sort of side dish to the meal of this book, but the visual feast in the middle is quite something.
I may be setting myself up for a fall here, but unless I've kind of gone to sleep for 10 years and missed it, I think there's a small but definite Holy Grail buried in this book as well, where Bader is talking about the differences between Zeppo and Groucho, and in order to illustrate that, he quotes from an unpublished memoir written by Eden, Groucho's wife, which says a bit about how Zeppo and Groucho were different in social settings and whatever, and then suddenly provides us with what, as far as I'm aware, is the only actual documentary evidence for the I don't care to belong to any club story. Eden actually says that he went to this club with Zeppo. Zeppo wanted him to become a member, but Groucho absolutely hated it and the Friars Club came home and said, do you know who I sat next to at lunch? My barber and my tailor. And then got Eden to take a letter, and he started saying, I don't want to be a member of a club where I have lunch with my barber and my tailor. And then thought better of it, and the next day got her instead to take down, I do not care to belong to any club that will accept me as a member. That, as far as I'm aware, until now, has only been a totally undocumented, shadowy Groucho legend. But we've actually got something concrete here.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That stood out to me too. And I guess just because so many things did stand out to me, I didn't flag that in my notes. But yes, quite interesting. And another thing that makes Bader's work so important and so rich is just the access that he has to unpublished memoirs by some of the key players, and to members of the Marx family. I mean, there is just stuff here that no other writer has to offer. It's very much Bader's style to do like what you are describing, to sort of bury a holy grail. Not bury, but it's part of the clean, spare, crisp quality of the writing that I spoke about at the beginning of this conversation. And I'm not comparing these writers to place more value on one or another. I'm full of admiration for what Bader has done, what Joe Adamson has done, what Simon Luvish has done, and many other Marx Brothers writers. But it's just interesting to look at the differences as writers. When Luvish has a dogma to overturn. He blows a trumpet. Lubitsch says, all this time we've been under the false impression that this was true. But, dear reader, it turns out that a consultation with the historical record reveals, for the first time ever, drum roll, please. And Bader, just in his journalistic way, just lays it out. He never flags anything and tells you how important it is. He just reports it to you. And it's an interesting way to go through a Marx Brothers book. They tend to be written by stylists who write in a more mannered way, who try to invest the prose with something of a Marxian spirit. And writers have tried to do that, some very successfully, some less successfully. But it's just one way to go. I hasten to add that I'm not saying that Bader isn't witty. I mean, there is wit in the writing. He can be playful, and the books are compulsively readable and enjoyable. But he doesn't wink at the reader very often. He doesn't go for laughs. And when they come up, you appreciate them all the more. And for the Three Musketeers, when he says, "Let us follow a mustache on its journey," that's about as good as it gets. Well, that's our conversation about Zeppo, the Reluctant Marx Brother, the improbable and excellent Zeppo Marx biography, recently published by Applause and written by who else but Robert S. Bader. Obviously, this is a book we highly recommend.
Let me ask one thing before you wrap up here. What do you guys think of this cover photo?
Well, I noticed that it has a dog in it. Speaking of Harpo cover and the Zeppo cover, both feature dogs. I talked to Robert Bader about this not long ago. We were talking on the phone, and I can't remember. He was talking about a prospective other book that he might write in the future. And I said, well, you're going to have to find a picture with a dog for the cover.
They do look very nice on the shelf next to each other, those two books, don't they? Because they are so uniform, and so both in their different ways, books that you never expected to have on your shelf. So they do come as a very attractive pair, I think.
Yeah, they have a family resemblance, which I guess is appropriate. Another thing we didn't mention, but with the publication of the Zeppo biography, there is now a book about every individual Marx brother. Son of a Gummo, being
pretty hard to get your hands
yeah.
on. Have you got it? I haven't got it. Have you
No,
got it?
I don't have it, and I've never read it.
Well, there's going to be some people who dispute that because there's still one brother left, but it would be a very short book.
Yeah. Manfred, the blameless Marx brother. The one you couldn't possibly have any problem with. No dark side. Never went to Hollywood, never got corrupted. Before we go, a few quick words about Patreon. As you may know, if you love the Marx Brothers Council podcast and you want to get just a little bit more of it and also help support it and help us keep providing this show month after month, you can always subscribe on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Marx Brothers Council podcast. Or, if that's not your style, go to marxbrotherscouncilpodcast.com and click on the big orange Patreon button at the upper right corner of the homepage. At several paid levels, beginning at only $3 American a month, you can receive bonus segments every month, and at the top 4 levels, our beloved monthly postcard. The postcard arriving in January is what has become an exception. It was designed by me. I used to design most of these postcards, but we've been so lucky and had so many great guest artists lately. I haven't had to do one of these in a while, but I had an idea. Happens to be relevant to this month's episode. So we made that the January card. Then starting in February, another stretch with some great guest designs, beginning with a returning champion, Emma Levitt. And of course, at the top 3 levels, in addition to postcards and bonus segments, you get all kinds of wonderful gifts, mugs, tote bags, T-shirts, you name it. Well, all there is left to do now is play a little music. What are we going to listen to, Matthew?
Well, I think back in episode 55, we had Dan O'Farrell on as a guest, and he treated us to a splendid live version of his song Zeppo Speaks. So I think that inevitably needs to make a reappearance now. But we'll mix things up a little bit, and we'll have the original studio version from Dan's band, Accrington Stanley, who were very nearly a household name. Never quite got into enough households. But this is the kind of material that almost made them a household name. This is Accrington Stanley and Zeppo Speaks.
At the edge of the screen, there I am, that's me, barely in this scene. The others get the funny lines, the running gags, the slapstick triumphs. I'm waiting in the wings. There you sit and flirt and laugh, surrounded by all these bright sparks. I'm on the fringes of the cast, the one you always talk to last, and I feel like Zeppo Marx. Pick a game that I can win, take center stage again. This love interest is bored, year-long vaudeville tours spent in the wings. There you sit and flirt and laugh, surrounded by all these bright sparks. I'm on the fringes of the cast, the one you always talk to last, and I feel like Zeppo Marx. I feel like Zeppo. Start the show without me, you know where I'll be. Start the show without me. Start the show without me, you know where I'll be. Start the show without me. Roll the film without me, I don't know where I'll be. Just roll the film without me. Roll the film without me, I don't know where I'll be. Just roll the film without me. Start the show without me, who cares where I'll be? Start the show without me. Start the show without me, who cares where I'll be? Start the show without me.
The Marx Brothers Council podcast is produced by Bob Gassell, Matthew Conium's books, including the annotated Marx Brothers, the annotated Abbott and Costello, and That's Me, Groucho, are published by McFarland. Noah Diamond's book, Give Me a Thrill, The Story of Alsatias, is published by Beer Manor Media. To leave a comment and for more info about this and all episodes, visit us at MarxBrothersCouncilPodcast.com. For the latest Marx Brothers and podcast news, look for us on Blue Sky and Twitter. And join the fun with the largest and most vibrant Marx community online, a club that will have someone like you as a member. The Marx Brothers Council Facebook group. That's it for now. Mary!
That's an ovation.